主席，係。
Chairman, thank you. I'd like to follow up on what Mr. Leung said before the break. The Secretary said no one would include the funds in the PF reserve, but since the implementation of MPF in the year 2000, did the government find out how many people use MPF and how many use the PF system? Did the government carry out studies or examine the figures every few years? Even with the new MPF system, there is employers' contribution, so funds could be injected as employers' contributions. It could be as much as 20 or 30%, even within the civil service. Civil servants will receive an extra percentage in employers' contributions. So there are many possibilities. Could such abuse be prevented in the future by way of a system or by drawing the line? For retiring staff in NGOs, in the last few years, would there be additional contributions from the employers? Director? Chairman, for MPF and PF, we will have to look at the records. The NGO should look at, determine which staff are snapshot staff and which are non-snapshot staff. For snapshot staff, the contributions are very clear. As the Secretary said, we would subvent 5%, 10% or 15%, but for non-snapshot staff, we would look at the median number of years, and we would look at the ratio of snapshot to non-snapshot staff in NGOs, and we do compile the figures. For snapshot staff, as time passes, there would be less and less of them, and there would be adjustments accordingly. Chairman, I'd like to ask about Part 2. For Part 2 alone, we see major issues in administration, and in 1.14 C to E, and in 2008-9, the government granted a one-off $200 million fund, as well as another funding of $470 million 2014-15 to strengthen the NGO's central administrative and supervisory support. So in terms of strengthening the central administrative and supervisory support, what are the details? Can you explain in detail the recurrent funding of $470 million? In 14-15, we provided a recurrent funding of $470 million. And central administrative support refers to the head office. For instance, if an NGO needs to comply with new laws or the best practice suggested in the LSG manual, so these are all covered as central administrative tasks. In terms of supervisory support, and we have reinforced support on all levels. The $470 million also cover paramedical staff and $470 million will cover the P+2 arrangement, and so that the paramedical staff would be graded at P+2, which is above the median. The changes in CPI cannot cover other charges, especially given the sharp rises in foodstuff and other expenses. So that's why we reinforce our recurrent expenditure. The $470 million is put into many different uses, so hopefully the government can provide a breakdown on which portion of this fund is used for central administrative support. As for paragraph 2.9, from September 2015 to February 2016, the envisioning program on BPM was organized to cover good practices on financial management, HR management, corporate governance, and public accountability. So the intention was certainly well, but the government's role was unclear. So apparently it was just an experience sharing session between NGOs, but the government did not offer their views or identify past issues. So financially, in cases I, J, and K, all the operating expenses are included, and this is apparently not compliant. So after February 2016, we had the issue with the neighborhood support center. So did you omit your concerns and the public's concerns? Please offer more information on the $470 million fund. For the program or envisioning program held from September 2015 to February 2016, we held some seminars and workshops on various areas, and the SWD did have a role to play because the SWD invited experts and NGOs who are engaging in good practice to share their experience. For good templates and measures, we actually compiled a book after the seminars and workshops, and the book was distributed to all NGOs. In the seminars, we learned about good practices of different NGOs, including practices on long-term financial projections, some NGOs even shared their internal templates on financial projections, and these have been included in our book. Thank you. I talked about the workshops and seminars in paragraph 2.9 because for the sharing NGOs, they had not have a very accurate understanding of the agreements.
Did NGOs IJK share the experience, and then did they share how they calculate the 50%, or how should they understand the EMOD PE for the top management? I just want to know what's your role. What's the role of the government? You may say in a seminar you will have 1 or 2 hours to explain the rules. We've raised quite a number of questions. It seems that you dodge the crucial issues, though you have explained the original intention. Say, You are familiar with the 20-year development of LSG. But my concern is IJK. With regard to the breach of FSA, it seems that IJK didn't know they've breached the FSA. They need to know the core of the problem. Otherwise, even if you spend $1 million, it will, or the $100 million, it will be useless because they have a wrong understanding. Yes, this is point of view. Next, Mrs. Hill. I have some simple questions. Maybe members have asked before concerning the 25%. Say, and every year they produce a budget, and if they have a surplus, then they can only keep 25% of the money. Concerning the 25%, it is the accumulated surplus. Are there many NGOs which have the accumulated surplus? Accumulated surplus? Not too many. Not too many. Now, if they have to provide the clawback in comparison with the 165, out of 165, in 2015-16, 34 had to provide the clawback. That means that exceeds 25%, and they have to make the clawback. The cumulative surplus exceeds the operating expenses of the year by 25%. Over 30 of them, right? Yes, over 30. More than 25%. Say for those have surplus, usually they will over budget. So they have a surplus. Now they have a more relaxed budget, so they have reserves. And if the reserve is more than 25%, they have to return the money to the government, or the excess to the government. Do the majority of them have reserves? They have surplus less than 25%, cumulative surplus less than 25%. It's not that they deliberately keep more money. If they are unable to fully spend the money, they will keep in the reserve. I have already explained why they have reserve. Say, for example, if it is a new service, when we calculate the PE, we provide the midpoint. But if they got a new hand, then the starting salary is less than the midpoint salary. The money, therefore, is kept, and then after the build-up of experience and years of service, they will use it to pay their staff. Say maybe they have a PT, they want to have a PT, they are unable to get a PT in the long term, they may hire a service, a PT service, and that may be cheaper. And then our funding, therefore, is the excess or the surplus is put in reserve. They need the reserve because the staff will gain experience over the years, and the staff member will have increments. And sometimes they may need to pay more in order to obtain a service or to get a more qualified to get a qualified person to do the job. Therefore, they need reserves. And maybe you can resort to number 4 with regard to the 25%. In 2017, 4.7 billion. From 2012 to 2016, altogether $17 billion. It's all public money. It is a big sum. Is there such a need for the NGOs to keep the money in the reserve instead of spending the money on service? Yes, thank you, Chairman. Now you have the midpoint salary as a basis calculation. They recruit someone less than the midpoint salary, therefore there's a reserve. This is one of the reasons. It's not their budget. When we calculate the lump sum grant, we have a formula. According to a formula, when we calculate PE, we base on the midpoint salary scale, midpoint of salary scale. So the NGO will have to do some adjustment and juggling. If they employ a less experienced staff, then there will be a surplus which will be kept in the reserve. So they recruit someone below the midpoint salary, and therefore they have reserves. Just now, Mr. Xiu has been sitting there and he can't ask questions. We received 5 letters, and we can ask questions. I heard from Mr. Xiu Ka-chun that the frontline staff are paid very low salaries. In fact, the government pays enough money to the NGOs, but the NGOs do not pay according to the midpoint salary, but they pay a lower salary to Mr. Xiu. It is hard to regulate the NGOs. Each NGO is independent. That is a formula which is 1.9, which has been said in 1.9 and 1.12. And that has a bearing on how they make use of the money. And that leads to the 4 areas, and they have reserves, and therefore they have reserves. Now they have paid staff members lower than the midpoint salary, and therefore they have a surplus. We just look at number 69 report. We just want to know what are the reasons for the reserves. But we cannot regulate how much money the NGOs pay their staff. We cannot interfere with the policy. Well, I want to say this. Now you give them a sum to recruit staff members, not just 1 year, 2 years, but 3 years, but it's a cumulative surplus. They have a bigger and bigger cumulative surplus because they pay the salary less than what you have allocated for them in terms of PE. They pay low salary to their staff, and therefore there is a surplus. So they accumulate the money. Now you give them a sum, and then they try to suppress the salary of the staff. That is undesirable. If it is former, next time you should give a smaller sum so that they will not accumulate a surplus. If it belongs to a latter, they should have paid their staff higher. You should advise the NGOs that they should pay their staff higher instead of paying a low salary. Otherwise, they will accumulate a lot of money year after year. And that leads to the problem above. Either you have made a wrong estimate or they have suppressed the salary of the staff members. You have heard the view of Mr. Xiu. But we cannot say whether your sums are correct or not. We can see that there is a surplus in your report. It's not a wrong estimate. I don't say that. That's a point of view. Your estimate is clearly in the paper. We understand this. How you estimate the numbers, we clearly understand this. The question is how you monitor the surplus. That's the area, scope of work of the PAC. Well, we just hope that members will not misunderstand the point. Say, a frontline carer, according to the government pay scale, is MPS 3 to 7. We pay PE in terms of between for P.5. It is not an estimate. It's based on the government salary midpoint of the scale. Yes, we see that in the report. It's clear. The issue is whether the money is spent in a reasonable manner, so that there is a cumulative surplus of $17 billion, and whether the NGOs have exploited their staff members. But this is not the scope of our investigation. But we can raise this issue, Mr. Xiu. and the panel can follow the matter up. Chairman, understand the explanation of the secretary. Now you explain that it's based on the midpoint, but the NGO does not make full use. NGOs do not make full use of money. It should be 3.7. Midpoint is 5. They should pay their staff on 0.5, but they just pay the staff on 0.3. They do have the money. Now next time you should cut the funding. That is definitely not our recommendation. Page 27. Table 9. And also para 2.14, the two NGOs. NGO 9 and NGO K. Concerning the staff they employ. They are senior staff, I believe. The annual salary is between $500,000 to $1 million. NGOK in 2014-15 between $500,000 to $1 million, 75. 2015-16, 76, from 76 to 133. They have a annual salary of $500,000 to $1 million. There was a substantial growth. And as for those earning more than $1 million, the number increased from 15 in 2014-15 to 19 in 2015-16, an increase of 4. The percentage is also very high. You're not supposed to disclose the actual name of the NGO. Why suddenly there was such a big increase? In fact, the director has already answered the question. Can you be concise in answering this? In fact, the question has been answered, but since Mrs. Xu has asked the question, we ask her to explain it again. The NGO didn't specifically employ high salary staff members. There was such a jump because some staff members had already reached the top point, and together with to follow civil service pay adjustment, there was a jump of a point, and therefore the amount exceeded $500,000. They've reached maximum pay point, and in that year suddenly, during that period, they jumped from one point to another. They explained that this morning. But that NGO does employ a lot of people. They have so many staff members, and we don't know their name. We don't need to know. We just look at the numbers. How can we assess? Well, it is the government's role under the FSA. That is a supervisory system. What's the point of raising this by the Audit Commission? This is very important. It's public money. And public money has to be well spent. Our responsibility is to understand the issue and how they make improvements. I don't know what this NGO is doing. They employ more than 19. They employ 19 people earning more than $1 million, and they employ more than 130. They employ 133 people earning more than $500,000 to $1 million. I really don't know what they are doing. Why they have such big salaries? Now, in reviewing or supervising these NGOs, do they comply with the FSA? They have annual reports submitted to you. So can you explain that? Under the LSG system, we do not exercise input control. We exercise output control. Each FSA is subject to service quantity and service quality, and there are service standards and outcomes. And we look at whether the NGO to see whether they achieve the standards. And the NGOs, in particular NGOs K and 9, do or did reach the targets. You just count the heads. Now, Mr. Siu, the FSA clearly spells out the output in terms of headcounts and in terms of quality of service. In parts 3 and 4, such questions will be asked. Okay, good. Do you want to ask more questions, or you want to? Do you want to add to your answer, or you want to wait until parts 3 and 4? Better wait. All right. Then concerning cumulative reserve, if it exceeds 35%, then the excess will be given back to the government. And 34 did so, if I heard it correctly. Among the 100 or so NGOs, what is the average? What is the average kept in terms of percentage? 165 NGOs. Yes. What is the average? Now you're concerned about clawback of reserves. In 2015-16, 34. And the amount clawback, 41.6 million. The amount is not too big. Yes, I know. Yes, they make the clawback about 35%. From 0 to 25, how many percent of them have kept the surplus? Now you say 34 have exceeded 25%. And there are 165 NGOs. Among the 165 minus 34, there was a surplus of $4.7 billion. Mrs. Siu referred not only to those above 35%. Now they've kept so much money. They were below 25%. But the money were not spent. Maybe you can explain according to Table 5. You can explain to Mr. Siu with Table 5. Yes, it is complicated. And we need to spend a lot of time to understand this. So you experts, please explain to us with the aid of Table 5. Yes, I do want to use Table 5, which is on page 28. Table 5 provides the 3 types of reserves of the total 165. The first column, LSG reserves. Second column, holding account. Third column, provident fund reserve. It can be spent only on provident fund and cannot be mixed with other reserves. But for columns 1 and 2, they are reserves of the NGOs, and we lump them together in calculating the reserves of the NGOs. Now, in the first 15, that is overlapping. 15 and 22, that is overlapping. The maximum, or the greatest number, is between 1 million to 5 million. There is the most number of institutions.
For reserve from $90 million to $100 million, and there was only one such NGO with the total LSG reserve falling in this bracket. So we see the highest number of NGOs falling in the bracket between $5 to $10 million. But altogether there were 2 organizations, or 9 organizations, with a balance of $10 to $20 million of reserve, etc. My point is this. The reserve is snowballing year after year, and if they were allowed to keep the reserve, and according to papers, they did use reserve to deal with their internal issues. For example, in 2.0, according to this paragraph, they might utilize the reserve to make incentive payments to staff. Is it the case that they are sitting on huge reserves? They have billions of dollars on reserve. In fact, they have over-budgeted every year. That is why they are able to keep such a huge reserve. Because if you can keep a reserve of 25% year after year, they will be able to save up to, $10 billion in total. Director. But let's bear in mind that these are non-profit making organizations. They serve the community and they provide the necessary services for us. The government should take this into account. We must not focus on the books. I don't want to give this wrong recommendations. I understand that these organizations are non-profit making, but in the community there are voices criticizing the fat sums of salaries earned by the senior staff. Well, to be frank, they may have an annual salary of over $1 million, but we need to look at the reality of the private market. We're not talking about exorbitant sums of salaries. They may be receiving high salaries, but we're talking about university graduates having served the organization for many years. And they have reached the maximum on the salary scale, and the government therefore should be fair to them. I'm not trying to answer questions on their behalf, but we need to understand the reasons of these NGOs and the target recipients of the service, and also the commitment in serving the community. So apart from checking their books, we also need to understand their intentions. But please go on. I basically agree with Chairman. These are non-profit making organizations. They serve the community. But the point is, they are not civil servants. We cannot check them. I understand their devotion and their commitment in serving the community. But the reality is that they're sitting on the $10 billion of reserve coming from the public coffers. That is why we still need to keep them in view. And according to paragraph 2.10, they consider using the LSG reserve for incentive payments to staff. Do you know what this is about, Director? Chairman, thank you for explaining the deeper meaning of the NGOs. They are non-profit making in nature. And I want to clarify once again that it's not the case of over-budgeting. They keep a certain percentage as reserve for operational needs. The reserve may be used for different purposes, one of which may be to improve the pay conditions for the staff. They may be used for the purpose of career development of staff and also for other contingencies. An incentive payment is part of their pay policy or measures on staff arrangements. But I need to point out one thing. In our best practice manual, communication and monitoring of staff is equally important. We also encourage NGOs to properly utilize the LSG reserve. And they are also required to make transparent to the staff the amount of reserve and how they're going to utilize the reserve. And the NGOs are keeping up with the times, and they are encouraged to communicate on a regular basis with their staff. But if the percentage is so huge, 25%, I wonder how it should be dealt with. Secretary, 25% is the accumulative reserve. That is 25% of the annual operating cost, not just 25% every year. Because I think that I need to clarify this point with the member. Another point I wish to clarify is that it's not the case of cumulative $10 billion reserve. According to Table 4 for the LSG is $1.7 billion, altogether $4.7 billion. You cannot add up all the figures from 2012 to 2016. We're talking about the accumulated reserve of $4.7 billion as of 2016. All right, so we're talking about $700, $800, $900 million, etc. Right, so this is already the total accumulated reserve, altogether $4.7 billion. All right. Chairman, you explained about the deeper meaning of NGOs. I won't dwell into that. Well, this report is quite complex. A lot of calculations are involved. And in the report, it is a lengthy report. It takes time for us to understand certain issues. And that is why we need to explain matters not only to ourselves, but to members of the public. The need for the existence of NGOs, the services they provide, and other pay-related matters. Mr. Lam Chuk Ting. Perhaps today you would like to ask the administration wing and the director of administrator and MSTB so that we don't need to go back to part 3 and 4 next time. We need to save time for the value for money audit. Perhaps we could save time and put questions to the director of administration and the MSTB so that they don't need to come again. Kenneth. About 2.33, I still have some questions. 2.33, Table 12. It relates to some internal control weaknesses in accounting inspections. May I clarify this point? The SWD did regularly conduct random inspections on NGOs or ASUs on the financial monitoring and internal control of these ASUs. It's regularly done by the SWD, right, Director? Well, Director, perhaps not everybody understands what NGO is, what ASU is. Perhaps you can explain to those watching the webcast the relationship between the NGOs, the agreements that they sign, and the ASUs, and that there may be different ASUs in an NGO. All right, perhaps I'll make it more accessible to the public. Let me explain. Each NGOs may have different service units called ASUs. There could be, say, an elderly community center, daycare center, and also a residential care home for the disabled. For each unit, we signed an FSA with the NGO in relation to the service and financial arrangements. It's called Funding and Service Agreement, in which we stipulate the service items to be provided, the service standard, the service quality, and we have the SQS, Core Service Quality Standards, and also core requirements. For example, a physiotherapist must be employed. These will be stipulated in the FSAs. And the FSAs are signed between our department and the ASU, the unit, not the NGO as a whole. All right, understood, Kenneth. So when you conduct inspections financially, I'm not talking about service quality, but on financial matters, do you engage professionals or do you use your own staff in the department or what? For accounting inspections, we have the financial branch colleagues who are professionals in this regard. We don't ask the social workers to do it. In Table 12, I see information about accounting inspections. And then Table 13, it sets out the internal control weaknesses of NGOs, ASUs. We conducted these exercises in 2014, 15, 16, etc. I don't know whether the same organization was committing the same mistake, because in terms of the total number, the trend wasn't a declining one. I mean, there were fluctuations, but after conducting the inspections, your colleagues will prepare a report. But what about the follow-up work? For example, after preparing report, would your colleague discuss with the ASUs concerned the financial irregularities or internal control weaknesses identified, requesting that they follow up on these irregularities and improve things in the following year? And would there be another round of inspection? Secretary or Chairman, I'm quite concerned that the member may be mistaken. Table 12 and 13 relates to the outcome of the accounting inspections conducted by the Audit Commission. It's not the annual exercises conducted by the SWDs. It's not the case, as the member suggested, that the same mistakes were committed afterwards. But it is said that these are the exercises conducted by the SWD's financial branch. Of course, the accounting inspections were conducted by the SWD, and then the Audit Commission reviewed your work between 2014 and 2016, right? So you conducted inspections between 2014 and 2016, and then the Audit Commission referred to your outcome. Perhaps I'll invite the director to interpret this. Dr. Leung's interpretation is correct. We reviewed the work conducted by the SWD, and the analysis of their work is given in tables 12 and 13. So mostly it was the SWD which conducted the inspections. There should be such basic information in the report. The only difference is that the Director of Audit provided an analysis for you. So basically, you should be able to identify these irregularities among subvented organizations, right? These are the problems identified in your own record, in your own report. That means over the years, these irregularities have recurred. And after conducting inspections, I'd like to know how you followed up on the matters with the NGOs. Secretary, is it true? And then is it the case that the ASUs have continued to commit the same mistakes, and what did you do about it? In Table 12, Chairman, it sets out the common irregularities and internal control weaknesses found in accounting inspections. Sometimes the irregularities did not come from the same organizations. For example, the invoice not stamped with a paid chop upon settlement. These cases came with concrete evidence. Then also sometimes transfer of sums weren't made until 6 months later. And these were irregularities identified by our financial branch, and we immediately followed up on the matters. We did not wait for another year. After identifying the irregularities, we require instant rectification. We followed up on the issues immediately, and every year we issue reminders to organizations, reminding them of the importance of internal control procedures. In a certain year, for example, we found that there was a delay in the transfer of accounts, etc., we would issue reminders to them. My question is this: let's say if an organization committed a series of mistakes, you would you remind them to rectify the mistakes, and then after some time, perhaps a year, another financial or accounting inspection would be carried out. Was it how you did it, or did you do it by rotation? Say 1 to 20 this year, and then some other NGOs following year. You just went through the motions. So let's say for organizations committing a series of mistakes, would you monitor their improvement? Can you tell us how you did it and how you're going to do it in future? Right, Chairman, this is of course within our consideration. Our inspections are done on a random basis, but once we identify breaches which we considered more risky in certain organizations, we would step up our effort. Well, say for organization K, after identifying the problems, you would review the situation once every few years, right? I think, Kenneth, I think that's all I have for the time being. Other members? Well, if there is no need to put questions to the Director of Administration and the FSTB, we wouldn't require their attendance next time. Mr. Lam, if there are no other questions, let's have an early adjournment today. And Secretary, you can also take an early rest, and we'll move on to part 3 next time. Any other questions, Mr. Lam? Well, let's follow your good sales order. Because we've put a lot of questions already, I must apologize. We have asked a lot of questions because we're unclear. And the tables can't quite explain everything. So thank you. Let's save the questions for next time. Thank you.